On April 21, 1945, while Berlin was already under ground attack by Zhukov's Red Army some 150 kilometers further south, German Marshal Ferdinand Schorner launched a counterattack that would go down in history as the last victory of the German army on the Eastern Front. So in this offensive, some weakened German forces that only a few days ago had been torn to pieces by the Soviet army, managed to quickly regroup and present this last fight when all was lost. But how was this possible? And what impact did it have? Well, that is exactly what we are going to see next. By the beginning of April, the German army was defending the banks of the Oder River, which is located to the east of Berlin, and the Neisse River to the southeast, which in turn connects with the Oder. Despite the total collapse that had occurred a few days ago on the Western Front, the last German units such as the 9th and 17th Army, and the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies, awaited the final Soviet assault in these positions. As we have analyzed in other programs, once the Soviets began this final offensive against the Third Reich, it was precisely Marshal Schorner's front in Neisse that was the first to sink. Thus, while General Heinrich's forces held out in the Silo Hills, on April 17 the Second Polish Army, which was embedded within Konev's First Ukrainian Front, penetrated widely into the German defenses south of Cottbus. In just one day, the Soviets had opened a gap of 28 kilometers, and after making a turn to the northwest, they began to approach the city of Lublin. Let us remember that this city was very important because it had been the point at which Stalin had established the operational freedom of Konev and Zhukov. In other words, if Ivan Konev managed to get there before his comrade Zhukov, he could be the one to advance towards the conquest of Berlin to the south. This made, as we can imagine, that both Soviet marshals attacked with the greatest possible ferocity, in which the only thing that mattered was to advance as fast as they could. Over the next few days, Konev's First Ukrainian Front continued to advance at full speed, and by April 20th it had already conquered Bautzen and reached the height of Dresden, in an advance of more than 100 kilometers. While to the north of said position, Zhukov gradually began to overcome the German defenses at Silo after 4 days of heavy fighting. As we see on the map, Konev's advance had occurred in a fairly linear fashion from east to west, with a turn north towards Berlin on the right flank, with which he had also encircled some 200,000 Germans on the known as Halbiesberg. On the other hand, this Soviet penetration had left their southern flank quite neglected, assuming that after the heavy defeat they had just inflicted on the Germans in that sector, there was not much to worry about. Thus, although they continued with their corresponding reconnaissance flights throughout the area, they did not detect the concentration of troops that Schorner was making south of Bautzen, due in part to the fact that it was a heavily wooded area. This led the Polish general who commanded the Second Polish Army, which was located in that sector, not to comply with the orders he had received from Konev to protect the region, and instead decided to advance towards Dresden. Schorner's plan was to launch a counteroffensive against this unsuspecting Polish flank, with which he hoped to paralyze the advance that the right wing of the First Ukrainian Front was making in the sector. In addition, the German marshal also hoped to continue advancing north to connect with Bussy's troops, who had been retreating from the Oder, with the intention of jointly supporting the defense of Berlin. For this counterattack that the Germans were going to launch in the direction of Bautzen, the recently promoted Marshal Schorner had 3 panzer divisions, one of them being Hermann Göring's own division, the 20th and 21st. In addition, he had 2 infantry divisions and another Volksgrenadier. In total, they added about 50,000 troops with about 300 tanks. The man in charge of directing the attack was General Hubert Grazer, who had commanded the 4th Panzer Army since September of the previous year, and that since then, it had not been able to do anything other than retreat little by little from the Vistula River to its present position south of Bautzen. On the other hand, the Polish Second Army had approximately twice the strength of the Germans, although it was far more dispersed over the territory. The Polish 8th and 9th Infantry Divisions were in the vanguard leading the attack in the direction of Dresden, along with another Soviet Army Corps further to the northwest. Further back, the Polish 5th Infantry Division marched along with a tank brigade, while the 7th and 10th Infantry Divisions had not yet crossed the Neisse. Once again, and as had happened so many times, the Soviets had their largest size in their favor, while the Germans had a part of their troops with a lot of combat experience. In addition, their concentration of forces in the vicinity of Bautzen also gave them quite an advantage compared to the dispersion of these new Red Army units. Well, after having made this presentation of the rivals faced and their situation, let's go to the development of the battle. The German attack began on April 21st, led by the 20th and 21st Panzer Divisions in the direction of Bautzen, and the 17th Infantry Division on Niesky. It should be noted that along the way, they were able to add to the fight German soldiers who had been isolated by the terrain after the Soviet penetration. The first reaction of the Polish General Karol was to ignore the German attack and not give it much importance, because he did not think it was anything serious. So, he ordered the vanguard of his army to continue advancing towards Dresden. The result of this first day was the near annihilation of the Polish 5th Division, as well as the tank brigade that accompanied it. Regarding territorial gains, it should be noted that the Germans advanced about 20 kilometers in its central part, while on the left flank they stayed at the gates of Bautzen. During the following days the Germans continued advancing, and it was then that the Polish general became aware of the danger his forward divisions ran of being completely isolated. It was then that on the 23rd, he ordered the advance to Dresden to be halted and to concentrate on repelling the German attack. By that date, the Germans had already recaptured the city of Bautzen, as well as dozens of small towns in the region, now establishing the front line about 15 kilometers north of Bautzen. Faced with such a situation, the Soviet response did not wait any longer. Konev sent 8 units of his army to block the German penetration, among which the 4th Guards Tank Corps stands out, which went to the town of Kamenz to put an end to the German advance. In addition, the Soviet 2nd Air Army was assigned to crush General Grazer's troops from the sky. By April 25th, a Soviet counteroffensive was launched against the German right flank covering the 545th Volksgrenadier Division and drove it back. In addition, with all these reinforcements, the Soviets consolidated a defensive line to the northwest of the small village of Lupa, which rejected any new German breakout attempt. During these days the worst part was taken by the Polish 9th Division, which had been isolated in its advance towards Dresden, and which on the 26th received the order to withdraw and re-establish contact with the Red Army units. Thus, it was forced to have to cross the German lines, and after being intercepted in its territory by the Germans, it suffered heavy losses. These days that go from April 25th to 28th were characterized by a series of combats throughout the German penetration wedge, in which while the Germans were gradually diminishing, running out of ammunition, gasoline, and troops, the side Soviet was only getting stronger. Thus, by April 28th, the German offensive was stopped dead with no further chance of advance. While Konev could have launched a general counteroffensive back to Bautzen, all eyes were on the latest fighting in Berlin. On the other hand, it made no sense to attack to the south at that moment, since the definitive offensive on Prague would be launched a week later, after the regrouping of all the troops assigned to said mission. The casualty count was catastrophic for the Poles, who suffered between 18,000 and 25,000 casualties, including some 5,000 deaths and the loss of almost 60% of their armored vehicles, representing some 200 tanks and vehicles lost. Thus, it is striking that this was the bloodiest battle of this Polish army since the one they suffered in Basura in 1939, in which they had some 50,000 casualties. On the other hand, the Germans suffered the loss of about 6,500 troops, of which 1,600 were killed. Although we can consider this battle as a German victory because they achieved a penetration of the enemy lines of about 25 kilometers, on a global level it lacked importance because it did not achieve the objective of paralyzing the advance of the main force of the First Ukrainian Front, headed for Berlin, nor connect with General Bussy's troops surrounded in Halby. In any case, it did stop the Polish advance on a Dresden that had recently been practically destroyed in the bombardment of the Western Allies in mid-February. Well, this that we have seen is the last battle that the German army won in World War II, being a victory that they again obtained over the Poles, just like at the beginning of the war. If you want to analyze in depth what happened in the Siege of Halby, or other operations such as the counterattack that was also attempted in Pomerania in February 1945, I leave both programs in the description. Thank you all for being part of this community, and especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and we'll see each other here as always, next Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.